2, 3.
The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines 86th as, quote, to get rid of, to remove. 86th is a 19th century slang expression, but in the 21st century, its meaning has become as mild as moving a menu item from a restaurant. But more typically, it's still associated with throwing someone out of somewhere, usually like a bar or a restaurant, or sometimes a country. In the 19th century, to be 86 meant to be gotten rid of permanently, as in killed. The unlucky stiff was taken out 80 miles into nowhere, had to dig his own grave, and then was buried 6 feet under. 80 and 6. I'm Mark Barenbeck. The cautionary tale I bring you is about 2 Jewish Americans, my wife, Joanne, and I, who made Aliyah to Israel in 2010. Over the following decade, we went back and forth between Israel and the United States every number of months. We got stuck in the United States for a year and a half during the COVID-19 pandemic. When I was able to fly back to Israel in 2021, I found out then that we had been 86th out of our Israeli residency while we were gone. Although still technically citizens of Israel, we now had no residency benefits or rights. I came to learn then that we had been removed for not living up to a rule called the Center of Living, a phrase I hadn't heard before, but which meant we had not spent enough time in Israel, especially in the last 2 years. To jump ahead a bit, the twist in the story comes in finding out later that maybe this Center of Living stuff was really a shakedown to further tax us, which, unfortunately, seriously damaged our ability to continue going back and forth to Israel. But before we get to the shakedown part, let me introduce Joanne to explain how we got to the point of being 86th.
I initially visited Israel in 1989. The tour was a fact-finding mission with a politically liberal group. We visited Jews and Arabs in the territories, including Gaza and the Jabalia refugee camp. The purpose of the trip was to see how Jews and Arabs were coming along on the two-state solution for 2 people. Those were the days of so much hope that the Oslo Accords would lead to lasting peace. Being a lifelong member of Hadassah and a nurse, I visited Israel again in 1990. This trip with other nurses from Hadassah was an introduction to the state of healthcare in Israel. We learned about advances in nursing care there and shared some of our knowledge. We met with our counterparts in Israeli hospitals, and we also visited in the Palestinian areas, such as Jabalia, to speak with local Palestinians living there. By the latter part of the 1990s, Mark and I were taking tourist trips to Israel, usually twice a year. After he retired in 2001, first he and then we volunteered with Sarel, the volunteer wing of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. During the 3 to 4 week tours of duty, we lived and worked on Israeli army bases and once on a naval base in Haifa. We also spent a month working in a nursing home and living in a nursing home in Rishon LeZion. This was different from anything I had ever done, and it gave us a glimpse into living in Israel. By this time, we felt we were moving in the direction of Aliyah. During the Gulf War, we were stationed at an IDF base outside of Tel Aviv called Tel HaShomer. There, I was working to prepare emergency medical kits to be used to treat wounded soldiers in combat. On a Sabbath trip to Nahariya in 2005, we discovered the place we wanted to live in Israel. By 2006, we found just the right apartment, bought it as is, and put together our plan to make Aliyah as soon as I retired. We went ahead with starting the application and sending in all the paperwork directly to the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem. During our IDF volunteer stint at the naval base in Haifa, we made an appointment to meet with a representative of the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem to review our application and have the mandatory interview for final approval. We apparently had all our paperwork in order and passed our interview with a lovely older gentleman who himself had made Aliyah from Great Britain years before. He pronounced us officially accepted for Aliyah and told us we could have our Aliyah visas as soon as we wanted. I was so excited and happy at that moment. I felt I was being welcomed to the next part of my life. I explained our date to retire in the next year. He said that was fine. We should give the agency our file number when we were ready, and they would issue us our Aliyah visas then. During the interim year, the Jewish Agency had turned over American Aliyah application work to an organization called Nefesh B'Nefesh. I should have had an inkling then that future contacts with ministries of the Israeli government would be chaotic and not always successful.
With the advent of the vaccines and breakthroughs in treating COVID-19, travel began to open up, and by 2021, I was able to fly back to Israel. Israel seemed different when I landed at Ben Gurion. Israelis I encountered seemed shell-shocked from the pandemic, numb from the lockdowns, the overcrowded hospitals, the long illnesses, the deaths of family and friends. While checking on our status with our bank branch and our healthcare providers, etc., it seemed something was amiss. When I went to our healthcare clinic, the clerk at the front desk could not find any record of us ever having been a member or having received any care from them. Now, Joanne had had emergency surgery and a prolonged hospitalization in Israel, and yet there was no record that any of that had happened. It began to look like we had never been residents of Israel. I found out that the local office of the Ministry of the Interior wanted to talk to me as soon as possible. I went directly to the local offices of the Interior Ministry early one Friday afternoon. I was escorted into a room by a guard and told where to sit. Two burly guards, one on each side of me, appeared as if out of nowhere. A woman, obviously the boss, flanked by a minion of ministry employees, were all sitting together in a row, facing me, behind a glass barrier. In some ways, it reminded me of a weird version of the Last Supper. Woman, speaking to me in English, explained, with no further introduction, that our residency status was taken away from us because we had violated the Center of Living rule. Someone, somewhere in the Ministry of the Interior had determined that our primary place of residence was in the United States of America and not in Israel. And for this, we were punished by having our residency status removed. Although she pointed out that we were still citizens of Israel, we now had no rights of residency. This was final. No notice, no process, no appeal, no nothing. I tried to explain about our balancing the last 10 years in a half and half mode, but that got me no sympathy from anybody. Telling this lady about being stranded in Oregon during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, as self-evident as it sounded, got me only a stony glare. No one in the minion of ministry employees said a word, and all kept their eyes facing forward. The lady in charge then went straight to the chase and told me we had to decide on one and only one center of living. I asked how much time and what percentage of time constituted a center of living. Like 50-50 or 60-40? But no matter how many times I tried to steer the conversation in that direction, I never got anything specific from her. I thought we were about finished when she pulled out two multi-page questionnaires, just like the ones sitting in the drawer in our apartment in Nahariya, with their names already printed on them in Hebrew. She handed them to me over the top of the glass barrier and said that if we filled out the questionnaires and handed them back in real soon and agreed not to leave Israel ever, except for a week or two of vacation once a year, the ministry would consider restoring our residency status. As it was Friday afternoon and the Sabbath was fast approaching, I thanked the group for all this new information and wished them a good Sabbath. Getting angry or upset was not an option, as the two burly guards were still flanking me, and I assumed they were ready to dive into action if I gave them any trouble. Two big guards walked me to the door, and I went home shell-shocked, to say the least, and not sure what had just happened. It was a week later that I checked online as to what the Center of Living thing is. It turns out that the Interior Ministry is the government agency responsible for citizenship and residency, amongst other responsibilities. It also turns out that the Center of Living is not a law, but a phrase coined by the Interior Ministry geared toward non-Jews who have a relationship with an Israeli citizen. And this rule is meant to control illegal immigration. A non-citizen and non-resident has to show proof of employment, a place to live, be a member of one of the healthcare services, and plan to live permanently in Israel. Now, the only other reference I could find about the phrase Center of Living comes from the Israeli National Insurance. They list two tests to determine Center of Living and therefore residency. The first test is objective and includes having a residence in Israel, assets like money in the bank, family, and employment. The other test is subjective, and this is geared towards the individual's personal view of how they see their center of living, and not the state's arbitrary view. I don't think the center of living concept was meant to weed out people like Joanne and I, who already had made Aliyah, had citizenship and residency, granted more than a decade ago, owned an apartment, had a visible means of support, etc. What they had on us was that we split our time between Israel and the United States. That apparently was the major no-no for which they lifted our residency. The more I thought about this and the more I kept replaying the part of my interview with the Ministry of the Interior lady where she pulled out the 2 multi-page questionnaires and how she kept emphasizing that we could regain what they took away from us by completing the questionnaires. So the issue was not really how many nights a year we slept in our bedroom in Nariya. The real issue was giving them all our financial information and agreeing to give them more money. Give them what they want, and we could maybe have our residency back. Don't give them what they want, and we are 86th out the door. Born and raised a Jersey boy, I know a shakedown when I see one. My lawyer in Israel, the last 20 years, who was also a Jersey boy, likes to remind me that Israel is not Iowa, and laws and rules in Israel are not the same as here in the United States. But a shakedown is a shakedown, whether in Israel or in the good old US of A.
The saddest part for me is the chilling effect from how we were handled by the Israeli government on our son Aaron's relationship with Israel. Ever since he went on a trip to Israel with a Jewish youth group when he was 15, he was interested in all things Israel. He was active in our conservative congregation's youth group since before his bar mitzvah. He spent time with his father volunteering with Sarel on an IDF basis. The girl soldiers loved him. Once we had an apartment in Israel, he enjoyed flying over to visit. He opened up a connection with the Israeli staff of Nefesh B'Nefesh. He wanted to plan out a possible aliyah in support of his pop music albums that he was performing and producing. He went on an Israeli music tour, playing concerts and nightclubs around Israel. He even put on a concert for our Reform congregation in Nahariya that brought in a few thousand shekels for them. Once we had our residency taken away from us, Aaron ended up suspending and then canceling his plan altogether. I think what bothered him most was trying to understand why the government of Israel would punish his parents by taking away their basic benefits. After all they had accomplished in Israel over the last 30 years. He knew that if he was going to be successful as a singer-songwriter, he too would have to travel in and out of Israel. And the same thing could happen to him.
We miss going back and forth to Israel. We miss being there with our friends, and we miss our activities of daily living there. We miss the special feeling of Shabbat, and we miss celebrating the lineup of holidays that is unique to being in Israel. We would usually spend Friday evenings with our friends at our Reform synagogue, and then Saturday mornings with our friends at our Orthodox show. And often Saturday evenings being at a friend's house to light the Havdalah candle and to close out the Sabbath. And most of all, we miss walking the empty, carless streets on the high holidays in the one and only Jewish homeland. But you know what? No matter where we are, and no matter where we rest our heads at night, our home is still a Jewish home. And our sense of Zionism is as strong in our hearts now as ever. So, in spite of what the Interior Ministry says, we still believe we have two centers of living and continue to pray for peace in the land of Israel.
Shalom, y'all. Come back soon now.